Welcome back. In this lecture, we will talk about one of the most fundamental concepts in any programming language of the world, and that's variables and data types. So this is how we left our script.js file after the last lecture, and this was just to show you how to get started with JavaScript and how to connect the HTML file with the JavaScript file. But now we don't need this anymore, so I'm going ahead and delete this. Alright, so in all the lectures that are contained in this introductory JavaScript section, I'm going to use examples and variables of persons, things like names, eye color, job, or person's age. So let's now start with variables. As I said earlier, this is one of the most fundamental things that are contained in every programming language. And we can say that a variable is like a container in which we can store a value in order to use it over and over again in our code. And by saving a value in a variable, we don't have to write that value each time we want to use it. So it gets stored and then we can use it over and over again. And in JavaScript, when we first declare a variable, we do it like this. So var and then the name of the variable. And I will use name and then I will write John. And at the end of the line, I will put a semicolon. So this is a string, so we have to put it between quotes. We can use the single quotes, or we could have used double quotes like this. We just have to use the same at the beginning and in the end. So I'll leave it like this. And we can now go ahead and try to log it into our console. And do you remember how to do that? It's simple, it's just, again, console.log, and now instead of writing John or hello world like we did before, we can use the name variable. And if you write name like this, then it will retrieve the value of this variable, which is John. So if we now log the name variable, then what we will see is the value that is stored in that variable. This is of course console, not console. So let's now see it in the browser. So I will reload and here it is, John. And again we can see which line this came from in our file, and this will be useful later. I will actually now put these windows side by side so that I don't have to go back and forth all the time. You can do the same if you feel like that's a good idea. So, you just created your very first variable. Great, right? So let's now go ahead and declare another variable. This one will be the last name. So once again we use var and then last name. And let's call him Smith. So you maybe just noticed that I capitalized this letter here. And that's something we usually do in JavaScript or even in other programming languages when we declare a variable name which is composed of two parts, so last name. So then we write the second part with a capital letter here. And this is called camel case. And we could even go ahead and make this longer, and it would be like this, of John, something like this. So this is not necessary for now, so let's just keep it like this. And once again, let's log this. Console.log and last name. And now we have two logs here in our console. First John from this statement here, and second Smith from this line. Great. So let's create a third variable, var age, and let's say 26. So John is 26 years old. And I want to log it again, console.log, and then age. And I will reload it again. And then we have the three outputs. So you noticed that this time I didn't use the quotes because it's not a string, it's not text, it's a number. So it's something different. And this leads me to another very important topic, which is data types. And in all programming languages, there are different data types for things like these. So numbers, strings, true, false values, and even other things. So let's now take a look at the data types that we have in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, there are 5 primitive data types: number, string, boolean, undefined, and null. Primitive just means that these are not objects, so they are primitives, simple data types. First, JavaScript numbers are always floating point numbers, meaning that they always have decimals, even if we sometimes don't see them or don't define them. For example, 5 is like having 5.0. In other programming languages, you many times have different data types for integers and decimals, but not here in JavaScript. Next, we have strings, which we already seen with the John and the Smith variables, or better with the name and the last name variables. So strings are simply a sequence of characters. They're used for text. And next, boolean is a logical data type that can only take one of the logical values, true or false. So to make it simple, a boolean is either true or false. And we will see why this is important over the next lectures. Now the next one is a bit more difficult to understand. Basically, undefined is the data type that is automatically assigned to a variable which does not have a value yet. So we can say that undefined means non-existent. So this is what gets assigned to a variable if we do not assign it a value. And finally, there is another data type very similar to undefined, which is null. And null also means non-existent, but it's slightly more specific. And we will talk more about these two later. Now, JavaScript has something called dynamic typing. This means that you do not have to manually define the data type of a variable. JavaScript figures out the data type of a variable on its own and on the fly, meaning that we can even change the data type of a variable later in our code. So this can, of course, be very useful, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs. That's if we're not careful with what we do to our variables. Okay, so now that we know booleans, let's just try out and see what this looks like. So we can create a variable called full age, which will tell us if the person is full age or not. So let's call it exactly that, full age. And we will set it to false, or better in this case, it's probably true because John is already 26, right? So let me just log this to the console, full age. And here we go. All of the 4 variables that we have defined are now right here in the log. Now you probably don't see the usefulness of just logging these values here, because that's not really like a website here, right? So this is just usually for debugging. So when we're trying to hunt down bugs in our code, we log our data or variables right here to the console. And now it's a great tool for us to just simply output the data instead of having to worry about writing stuff here to our web page. All right, this should be enough for you to absorb in one lecture. In the next one, we will come back to variables and see what happens when we change variables and data types. So we will continue a bit with variables. So see you there.